I'm summing up by saying climate will continue to impact national budgets, compromise livelihoods, and exacerbate poverty. Without a change in response, climate change will to even greater degrees offset the gains we have already made in terms of priority development objectives. So it will offset the food security we are going after and the access to basic services. And it's going to transform the environment into a hazard. And this is the same environment we premise economic development on. What I'm really saying, if our current state is sensitivity, vulnerability, and inertia, then Jamaica's Vision 2030 to be the place to live, work, raise families, and do business is under threat. In our current state, climate change is grabbing our inertia and threatening our sustainability. So what do we do then? Well, I wouldn't like to leave you on that note, so let me end with this other note. You know what I'm arguing? I'm a physicist and I don't want an equation to my name that is wrong. So I'm arguing that maybe we need Taylor's equation of state version 2.0. And Taylor's equation of state version 2.0 would look like this. Sensitivity plus vulnerability plus resiliency equals sustainability. And this is what I think the equation to characterize our state should look like in the very near future. That would be a good equation. and so really what I'm saying climate is demanding is that we shift somehow or change from inertia to resilience. Okay, so let me end then by suggesting how we're going to move on this pathway to resiliency. This is where it gets a little shaky because I really, if I knew this, then Jamaica would be. But I think, you know, we are beginning to see that resiliency really demands that a couple of things are being considered. What are they quickly? One, if we're moving towards resiliency, then we have to give serious consideration to research, data gathering, monitoring, and risk assessment. Because together these actions help to define the risk posed by climate, provide justification for the responsive action, help target the response, inspire confidence in the response that it will be effective even though the climate is unpredictable. This is my unashamed plug for science and research. Resiliency requires that. What else does it require? Some consideration of adaptation. And it requires us to prioritize adaptation. Boy, even if global consensus were to reach to stop greenhouse gases emissions today, the world is already committed to climate change because of how much greenhouse gases we have already put. So we have to adapt to the new and emerging climate regimes, and adaptation has to be prioritized in our resilience strategy. It can't be an option, it has to be a necessary thing, and adaptation has a no regrets adaptation. So we need things like the agro-parks, which are adaptations really to climate change, and fortified and raised roads, diversify the tourisms, new building codes, strict zoning for where settlements can be, insurance for climate sensitive livelihoods, law enforcement, etc. Those are all examples of adaptation strategies, but probably need to be prioritized. And the responsibility for adaptation is not just with government, it's from individual right up to regional. Resiliency has to consider also not just prioritizing adaptation, but also prioritizing mitigation. Now in the climate change world, mitigation is trying to reduce the thing that caused the problem in the first place, which is the greenhouse gases. And I am saying, listen, the Caribbean must not become preoccupied with arguments about who must reduce and whether it's developed countries must reduce or we must reduce. Instead, we must judiciously support and propose our own models if necessary for differentiated mitigation targets for developed countries and developing countries, because current emission levels are simply unsustainable. We need mitigation that targets preservations of forests, because forests pull carbon dioxide out, waste reduction, because the more efficient you are at a process, it's the less amount of carbon dioxide you put out, efficient and alternate generation of energy for electricity, transportation, and industry, because alternate energy does not put out carbon dioxide. And all of these are going to have the spin-off effect of reduced economic costs, increased productivity, and improved quality of life. Mitigation is a win-win for the Caribbean. It is also the strategy that best links individual responsibility to corporate good. I can do something for the benefit of others. Resiliency has to talk about, recognize that climate change is not the only game in town. There are limited resources for development, and it is the same resources that must eradicate hunger and poverty, fight crime, provide equitable access to education, provide health services and basic amenities, achieve gender equality, build resilient infrastructure to climate and non-climatic disasters, treat with social injustice, sustain consumption and production patterns, restore and protect terrestrial and aquatic systems, deal with crime, and then after all of that, deal with climate change. But climate change is not the only thing in town, and resiliency has to recognize that. But what we have to do is make sure that adaptation strategies and mitigation strategies, which significantly overlap with the sustainable development goals, we explore the overlap and the synergies between them so that the limited resources are most efficiently used and to maximum impact. Resiliency has to recognize that well-intentioned responses can unfairly disadvantage. So we've already noted that there are some groups that are more vulnerable to others, and the impacts of climate change are disproportionately distributed. In a real sense, climate change singles out the already disadvantaged. So when we crafting mitigation and adaptation responses, we have to take care not to further disadvantage the already disadvantaged. So when we're diverting a river or a stream to create new domestic water sources for an urban region, we put at the disadvantage in these people who live upstream, including the natural world, who depend on the water for livelihood and existence. Response should not unfairly put one set of stakeholders at an advantage or disadvantage simply because of the side of the divide on which they fall. Resiliency has to make sure that education is there, because education is critical to buy in. I don't think I need to say anything else. Resiliency has to target present variability as a means of responding to future climate change. Go back to where I began. We have to live with the variability even as we contend with the change. And so, when you have limited resources, maybe the best option is not inaction, but just use the resources to target the variability you know. You expect that it may fall short, but it will dampen the effect of the future threat. So target the present variability as a means of responding to the future change. Resiliency has to recognize that risk-taking may be a demand of climate change. Achieving resiliency may require risk to be taken with the growing threat of climate, especially when the threat is moving outside the bounds of what is known, and when the response strategies are proving to be no longer sufficient. When a risky response is seen as the only option that you can take, it must be accompanied by the education, especially of all the consequences of its success or failure, careful consideration of the ethics of the action or inaction, continuous monitoring, data gathering, and scientific analysis from the very beginning. Because when risk is put in those kind of consideration, it's not careless risk. And so you can see that those are some of the considerations. So I end with this. Really, the path to resiliency will be through the incorporation of climate change considerations into planning, or mainstreaming of climate change into daily planning. And I simply wanted to say that the act of mainstreaming really is trying to routinize the consideration of climate in daily consideration. What we're asked to do is just begin to incorporate climate in daily planning. And when you begin to mainstream climate, you know what you're doing? You're ensuring that there's always an awareness that climate change is an issue. There's a reasonable understanding of the risk. There's a foreknowledge of the gaps. There's an explicit accounting for climate when you have new big decisions to make, especially those big decisions that affect development, livelihoods, and daily living. You have a proactive approach to dealing with the threats, and you are actively seeking out and grasping at all opportunities to build resilience. So in an environment of scarce resources, how do we mainstream? And this is where I end. Well, when the resources are scarce, I am suggesting that, in fact, what you do is find entry points in existing activities and either insert new actions to fill a gap or strengthen the existing activities so that the net result is greater resilience. So, if I was to offer you some kind of road to resiliency, it would look like this. It would be climate change education for all. So there must be a dedicated effort aimed at finding all entry points to educate about climate change. And we have to take advantage of the already formal systems of education. And then add on to it the professional training courses, the continuing education credits, and the Sunday and the Sabbath schools. Build the climate change education into what education opportunities exist. And then if we need to come up with contextually relevant material that have to be commissioned, then commission it and make it easily accessible. And then you have to target in education the most vulnerable groups. And then I would say, create a climate change registry. Now this could be a division, but a climate change registry. And what I'm saying is that when response is so dependent on external funding as it is now, and so often project-based and being initiated at various levels, then you need coordination of climate change activities. And that becomes critical to leveraging the current situation to maximum benefit. Not that the place has to do everything, they simply need to coordinate. And then we must strengthen community groupings and community governance. Because it turns out that community groups are often the first responders in extreme situations. And outside of disasters, they represent sustained on-the-ground capacity. So when you encourage vibrant community groupings of whatever form and invest in the strengthening of community governance through all levels, up to the local government, then the spin-off effect is facilitating resilience, or at least creating a scenario that can be exploited for resilience building. We have to promote values and attitudes. Why? Well, stewardship, equitable and fair use of resources, and the common good are important principles in sustainable development. These principles provide, in the face of climate change, a justification for the individual through to national response. They provide the overarching guidelines when formulating individual through national response. They provide the overarching guidelines for behavior and decision-making in the midst of and in the aftermath of a climatic threat. An ongoing values and attitudes campaign in conjunction with or even spearheaded by the faith-based communities is a resilience building effort. We have to prioritize water. Water is perhaps the issue of climate change for Jamaica and the Caribbean. Because of its direct and cross-cutting nature, any attempts to ensure water security, even independent of climate change, are direct attempts to build resilience. We have to prioritize transportation and roads. Now, under climate change, there is need for quick and easy movement of people and supplies, whether to points of greatest need or away from an imminent threat. Prioritizing the maintenance of coastal roads or even building new interior roads and highways facilitate coast-to-coast access and are important development strategies which have the spin-off of building resilience. Efficient movement is also a mitigation strategy to reduce emissions. Of course, these kinds of actions must take into account all the considerations I said before. We have to prioritize disaster risk management. The potential for climate disasters is only going to increase. A strong and effective disaster preparedness and response mechanism is building climate resilience. We have to always consider the environment, and forgive me for just dwelling a little. The environment and the natural world are currently exploited for economic development, yet they are often the secondary considerations in decisions related to economic development. But a degraded environment exacerbates the impact of climate change threats, and the environment is already among the most vulnerable groupings. The environment is one of a few areas, energy and waste being the other two, that facilitate both adaptation and mitigation responses in a resilience building effort. So even when compromise on the environment is required, it must not be such that it is unfairly placed at a disadvantage. Mainstreaming consideration of the environment and even displaying a little bias towards the environment with respect to protection and preservation will build climate resilience. We have to deal with joined-up government. The pervasive nature of climate change demands that plans and actions developed in one sector have to take into consideration the plans and the impact on another. So when we set targets, we have to set targets consistent across sectors. So the mix of fuels in energy diversification has to be consistent with the mitigation targets, how much we want to reduce the carbon dioxide. Sustainability of the resilience created may also depend on the collaboration across two sectors. So an emphasis on strengthening the mechanisms that facilitate cross-sectoral consultations and consideration will facilitate resilience.